Long before I moved here to Britain, when I was growing up as a boy in Texas, I saw the last glimpses of an America in which we all knew we had a common story, that we came from similar roots, that we share bonds as a people. I began school as part of that majority, but by the end of high school, I was a minority, and the pop culture, the music, was changing into a culture that was not of my people. The American nation itself was still more united, more so than today, but in poor urban communities like mine, it was being destroyed from within by demographic change, drug use, and the nihilistic atheism of an anything-goes culture inherited from the 1960s before my time. If you tolerate anything, you value nothing. What strikes me most looking back, upon losing my own culture to both endless social liberalization and mass migration from Latin America chiefly, but also beginning at that time South Asia, East Africa, and the corporate marketing of globalization, is how few baby boomers or post-war kids stood up and spoke out about losing our people when I was too young to. Now, I'm not saying that Mexicans cannot intermarry with us and have their kids be American as us. Yes, you can. But if a million Brazilians move to Kansas, I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore. Thankfully, the tide is turning, and I have great hope that J.D. Vance, Vice President as I make this video, is part of a new era many of us have hoped for our whole lives, the end of all the hippie nonsense. J.D. Vance said that the nation is not an idea, it is not an economic zone, it is a particular people. He used that phrase, particular people. He said this to European leaders in Europe who were scared of his words, because they are true. A nation is a people. I'm Benjamin Angwin. This video is a warning. We still just about have time to stop what I call the coming wars of European identity. Now grab a cup of tea, we are going on a journey. Plato could not speak Dutch. Netchev Plato siarad isoldereg. Around 5,000 years ago, yeah, that's a long time, Indo-Europeans burst out of the Eurasian steppe with the Yamnaya culture in one of history's most dramatic shifts in power. Europe had been on the cusp of creating civilizations as advanced as Sumer and Mesopotamia, but in present-day Ukraine and Romania, they collided with a warrior people who had other plans. This people was a group of peoples, really, who spoke a wide spectrum of Indo-European dialects, worshipped a sky father, and saw warfare as a spiritual experience. From around 3100 BCE to around 2500, the male lines of prehistoric Europeans were reduced by 90%. To put that into perspective, that is the level of Polish Jews lost in World War II, or the number of Native Americans lost averaged out over the Americas. Something really bad happened with this level of migration into Europe. More of the women survived, which suggests raiding parties killing men and taking the women as slaves. And whilst many of the old Europeans were absorbed on the female line, their native culture and identity vanished. This was the biggest migration into Europe for 5,000 years. But what is happening today in Europe makes the Indo-European migrations that formed our peoples look small. Since 1980, between 30 and 35 million people have migrated into Europe from Africa and Asia. Put that into perspective here. That's a 5 million gap between 30 and 35 million. So many have come. We're not sure if it's 5 million less or 5 million more. That's crazy. Nothing has happened in Europe like this since the Stone Age. This will not end well, And people across Europe raising this issue are being ignored by their own governments and called tyrants, or in modern speak, fascist or racist. Ironically, the beginnings of Western civilization itself show this too. Rulers ignoring their own people whilst calling them tyrants. In fact, this is how Western philosophy was born. People questioning the moral status quo of their rulers and their obsession with tolerance. Around 2400 years ago, by which time the old Europeans were nothing more than myths told by Indo-European peoples, an aristocrat was born in Athens named Aristocles, but you are more likely to know him by his nickname, Plato. This man laid the foundations of how our Western civilization sees the world. His ideas are realist, and he did not see democracy as a good thing. He hated democracy. He said rule by the people degenerates into mob rule, which allows tyrants to take over by twisting ideas like social justice and tolerance into a weapon against their enemies. He said when we take freedom too far, it leads to excess and decadence that destroys the state, or in his time, the people. If you have seen how the tolerance of a country like the Netherlands has been used against its own people today, the Dutch people, to stop them from questioning or objecting to being minorities in their own cities, this is eerily familiar. Dutch police have been removing the children of mothers who have spoken out about mass migration, calling them far right. This is tolerance being used as an ideology that is now weaponized against political opponents. This is what happened in Athens after regaining its independence from Sparta and declaring a democracy. Not the children, but the weaponizing moderation and tolerance. Athens voted to put Plato's teacher Socrates to death, the mob calling itself moderate and tolerant. Today, Socrates, the foundation of our Western democracy, would be called far right for his nationalist ideas and removed by police. Athens itself became little more than a socially liberal university town in other people's empires, after an age of civic anarchy and sexual decadence. Further west, in Sicily, at Syracuse, the rulers had chosen democracy before Plato, but had fallen into chaos, allowing tyrants to take over. Plato went there to warn them to try and establish a philosopher-king state. That was his whole idea. He wanted the philosophers to rule. I guess he had a bit of self-interest in the game, right? He was a philosopher. They ignored him, and Syracuse stumbled through a series of tyrants, coups, and civic chaos through the late 4th century BCE, just the exact degeneration sequence Plato described in his work, Republic. Democracy creates luxury, which creates weak men who allow tyranny. Tyranny leads to violence, and violence to instability, allowing foreigners to take your women. Syracuse was conquered by Rome in 212 BCE. I know I have gone on quite a loop here, but do hear me out. Our culture is in grave danger. We are arguing over petty luxury beliefs, like not eating beef or not offending fat people in gym class, and putting tampons in men's toilets, whilst allowing mothers to sell their own babies who grow up raised by men without mothers, as we import millions of people from cultures hostile to ours in the biggest human migration since the Stone Age. This is crazy. Then we call people racist for defending their own daughters from roaming gangs of predatory Muslim men whose holy book clearly says that if they take non-Muslim women in conquest, They will be blessed by their God. But this video is not doom and gloom, far from it. We can win this. We can save our peoples. Whilst Plato was right that democracy degenerates with luxury, he was wrong in that democracy can also heal itself if there is a wider concept of shared loyalty to a people. Of course, the nation state did not exist yet in his time. You had the right to attack what nations you could take, and nations came from the ethnos, meaning a people, a tribe, a group bound together by shared kinfolk, sometimes language. It is organic and inherited rather than chosen. You are born into an ethnos. That is your nation. What you want to be is a fantasy. You have a responsibility. Plato got a lot right, but he was wrong about this one thing regarding democracy, in my opinion, because he was living before the concept of nation-states, before that had been hashed out, after the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. This put an end to the 30 Years' War. If you don't know much about the 30 Years' War, I don't really blame you. It is only the most complicated war in all of human history. If you want to understand why Germans like order and rules, maybe it is because they saw the 30 Years' War and said, not that again. Actually, it is from Prussia, but that's another story. From the outside, this 30 Years' War, which produced the modern nation-state, looks like a war between two sides, the Habsburg Catholic Empire against Protestant rebels. But in actuality, there were 20 to 30 different sides fighting each other in this war. This was tribalization, not nationalism. Nationalism is what stopped this war, which had led to as many as 8 million dead, in an age when firearms and swords were used about equally. You had guys with swords charging lines of men, trying to get primitive muskets to fire, whilst they were both being attacked by crossbows and cannons at the same time. And I bring this up because of any war in European history. This kind of war is what Europe is heading towards. Not muskets versus swords, but maybe drones versus machetes? We are heading towards a patchwork of tribal and ethno-religious groups fighting over the identity of the nation. This is not a war like the materialistic ideologies of the 20th century as we saw in World War II and the Cold War. This is the opposite of that. Identity, honor, and faith matter. We will have to face this reality. We cannot live in the fantasy of 1960s Woodstock and Kumbaya forever. And we will, sooner or later, have to accept basic truths about mankind. Not only did this Peace of 1648 enshrine the ideas of the nation-state, it formally recognized Dutch independence in the Dutch Republic, but it built a world in which nations are equal to one another. That had never happened before. Spain could not just attack the Netherlands without reason again. Because of this, later on it gave Europeans a way to repair democracy through those in power having duties to protect the people, not just the individual person, even when power degenerates into the same decadent luxury beliefs which we are seeing in our rulers today. It did this by giving people a wider kinfolk group to declare loyalty to, whilst keeping demographic security of the dominant group within each state. This was just not possible in ancient Greece's city-states with their broken geography of fishing villages and often isolated democratic experiments, at least not to the same degree as it was in 17th century nation-states, where markets, better roads, and river travel allowed unity among similar groups from far away. If Plato had seen the Dutch Republic I think he may have changed his mind on democracy, but Plato could not speak Dutch. And yet, this kinfolk loyalty which allows us to repair democracy and to escape Plato's trap of tyranny, this is exactly what the peace of 1945, after World War II, has been attacking for all of my parents' lifetime and all of mine. To ignore the soul is most unwise. Tra enoith and mobidhi urenide. I've lost track of how many times I have run into people who actually believe that nations are a thing of the past. I mean, have they ever read a history book? Do you know how many times people have said that exact thing just before it all comes crashing down and Mongol hordes burn your cities? Do they think we are so morally superior to our own ancestors that cheap strawberries from Ethiopia and cheap t-shirts from China are worth giving up who we are for? Do they know nothing of the world's first empire, Akkad, the Akkadian Empire, who said the same thing as them 4,200 years ago and is now nothing but dust? The funniest part of Akkad's fall, in relation to our own time, is they literally incorporated a foreign ethnic group called the Gutians about a century before they fell, who destroyed them from within by taking over their cities. Sound familiar? The Gutians did not have farming practices like Akkad. They did not like administration, so they went around raping women, stealing stuff, and smashing the clay tablets which held all the records. This sounds like Birmingham, England, or the inner suburbs of Paris just about every summer now. What did we think was going to happen when we brought in millions of people from lands without basic civics, without anti-corruption ethics, without women's rights, or any notion of high trust in their culture? It's not as if they are so weak that they will become exactly like us within 3 or 4 generations. They're not any less than us. How is this not brewing future conflict in our cities? And what will these future conflicts look like? As Professor David Betts of King's College London notes, it will most likely be natives controlling the countryside, with urban enclaves held by imported nations and their leftist allies under siege. The Akkadians saw a very primitive form of this 4,000 years ago. The Akkadians were talented farmers, but farming was alien to the Gutians' culture and way of life. So you know what they did? They released all the animals to roam freely, which of course caused a famine, and then anarchy, and the Akkadian Empire collapsed into a patchwork of urban warlords taking over cities, which is in a way what I think is going to play out. From insurrections in Minneapolis and Portland, Oregon in America, to anarchic ethnic uprisings in Paris, Toulouse, and other parts of France, to hate marches in London and Toronto, imported gang wars taking over parts of cities in Sweden, and Brussels, the capital not only of Belgium but of the European Union, no longer being even 25% Belgian. Let me say that again. The capital of Belgium is not even 25% Belgian at this point. This is something similar to what happened in Akkad. However, unlike the Akkadian Empire, I think we will take our cities back and regain control over our own civilization. But this could be the worst period of warfare we have ever fought, because we're not dealing with conventional armies here. We're dealing with people chimping out, essentially, and declaring someone boss and storming cities. This will look much more like the 30 Years' War than World War II. that we hear the word remigration from right-wing parties more and more across Europe and now North America. That is not the extreme option. These are people on the right trying to avoid the calamity that is clearly coming if we do not address these demographic issues. Let's take a step back to Plato. How do we get to the point where not only do we have semi-autonomous ethnic enclaves forming in every major city in the West, but our cultural elite and ruling class see this as some kind of moral good that atones for our sins? How did this happen? Plato divided the soul into three parts. Whether I agree with him is unimportant, but this will provide us with a good metaphor for what happened to our Western nations after World War II. Plato's three parts of the soul were these. The first part of the soul, according to Plato, lives in the head and is called logos. This is related to reason, to logic, where that word comes from. And this part of the soul rules over the other parts of the soul, controlling it. Plato gives a metaphor of a chariot. The driver of the chariot is logos, the rational part of the soul, guiding it toward truth and higher things. Logos is a charioteer who has harnessed the other two parts of the soul, who are horses at his command, one good and one bad. The thymos is the spiritual part of the soul, the good horse, which is found in the chest and related to spirit, to faith. This is passion as well as joy, and there is a collective sense to this, almost like a national consciousness. But Plato does not go that far. He doesn't have those concepts at that time in history. Glory and honor also live here. The last part of the soul is eros, the bad horse, which is found in the stomach, and links to our base desires, erotic energy, sexual and our material wants. But also good things like beauty and freedom actually come from eros. Throughout the history of our civilization, we tried to balance the reason of logos and the spiritual nature of thymos, whilst controlling eros or trying to ignore it. After World War II, and actually after the whole horrific period, from the beginning of World War I in 1914 to the end of World War II in 1945, our civilization had a strange but understandable reaction to the horrors we saw. During that period, we changed the value system around these three parts of the soul out of a knee-jerk fear that any collective national identity would for some reason mean the return of Adolf Hitler, like some weird zombie that does not die. It is silly when you think about it. But we did not live in that time, and so I do not claim to understand why they felt our spiritual and nationalistic side to be bad, when nationalism is what stopped the Nazis. We flipped the good and bad, and with logos still in control, everyone had to be reasonable, moderate, and vote for either blue or red. But now, desire of self-liberation and selfish materialism came to be seen as good, and the spiritual collective nationalism of thymos came to be seen as bad. So traditional families, Christianity, that kind of thing, came to be seen as almost sinful. Do you see what happened there? We promoted selfish desire as we pushed down the spiritual in our society, and since reason was still in charge, it became unreasonable to seek depth, meaning, and spirit in our lives. There are, of course, other factors which were spread because of this changing of value in the first place. Birth control, pop music, aimed not at young adults courting each other, as was the case before the war, but at teenagers seeking rebellion, and rebellion itself became glorified, so that by the year 1968, a whole generation came of age who had essentially been brainwashed to think that their base desires and selfishness were virtues to defend against traditional spirituality. San Francisco and Paris erupted in a culture of ecstatic decadence, drug use, and turning those who hate our own culture into icons, almost as if by religious ritual. People like Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin became almost like saints that people worshipped. Jim Morrison, frontman of The Doors, his grave almost became a pilgrimage site for this decadence. Protest on university campuses became the equivalent of religious worship. Normal people who raise a family and go to church are made fun of and attacked, mocked in television shows, whilst those who give nothing back and push sexual boundaries are now seen as good. We live in a grotesque age. The Olympics, the recent Olympics in Paris, had people desecrating our traditional spirituality as a celebration. This will not end well. But eros and selfish desire in itself is not actually the main problem. This selfishness has been coupled together with logos, with logic, to create a worldview, to create a sense that wanting anything that's not decadent and selfish is illogical, turning against any view of the world which says that we are part of nations, that we are not the creator, that we are not God, and that glory is not for our emotions, but in the service of others. Our society has turned to vanity. In the 19th century, the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche wrote about something he called the last man, which was what men would become as a byproduct of modern democratic civilization. Yes, he did pull on Plato. This last man avoids risk, seeks comfort, wants everyone to hold the same lack of values, so that he does not have to think about virtue. And he chases endless entertainment in a nihilistic future, which seems to be put around our time in the 21st century. Adolf Huxley's novel, Brave New World, comes to mind, where we are fed endless desire to prevent any deep thoughts about life from ever forming. This is what we are living in, a hyper-modern last man, an overly democratic culture in which any depth, any duty is seen as a threat. Anything not led by the mob is called fascist, and in which cheap comfort is everywhere. As Plato would have clearly seen, that can only lead to the rise of tyrants. However, Plato may not have foreseen that because our leaders are so weak and decadent, they are not even good at being tyrants. We live in a time when our rulers are so weak, they're not even good at being bad guys. Another outcome of this reshaping of our morality following World War II is that the ruling class, especially in Europe, shows its membership to that ruling class by what for many centuries was called sanctimony. They are sanctimonious. But if you must force me to even understand modern words and how people degrade language, people today call it virtue signaling. Sanctimony is virtue signaling, and is as old as time. The difference today is that for many centuries, it was done through the church, sanctimonious clergy, where power was, and now it is performed on social justice issues related to our moral overreaction to World War II, in which how we saw ethnicity and later social progressivism was imported to Europe from radicalized American universities and fused with postmodern anti-Westernism from France and the Soviet Union, whose ideas were used to train the next generation of European leaders to hate themselves. These leaders, who were raised after World War II, saw nationalism as sinful in the same way that medieval people saw sex outside of marriage as sinful. Adultery, they can't bear the thought of even their own national flags. Germany's Angela Merkel may have been the pinnacle of this self-hatred ideology, which Gad Said wrote a book about called Suicidal Empathy. She allowed 1.2 million Syrian refugees into Germany from 2015 to 2016 alone. I mean, this is crazy. In a giant wave that is as big as the Gothic migrations into the Roman Empire, who eventually sacked the city of Rome, which had not been taken in 800 years. Have these people ever read a history book? Since I grew up in America, I am hyper aware. When I see post-1960s American race Marxism being used by politicians in Europe in a continent lacking the same roots, to put this into context, at the time of the American Revolution in 1776, the American colonies were around 20% black. African Americans are part of America's ethnogenesis as a nation, not to mention the Native American element. I consider American heritage to be a fusion of three distinct groups of people in a new people: Native Americans, of course, Central West Africans, and Northwest Europeans, among which were a few Jews. The ethnogenesis of European nations after the fall of the Roman Empire has no relationship to America's ethnogenesis in its intercontinental mercantile era roots whatsoever. Think about this. From the decades leading up to 1861, with the outbreak of the American Civil War, to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, we Americans fought, debated, argued, and disagreed over how to include African Americans in our culture. It took over 100 years for us to reach a compromise with just one large ethnic group, and the deal we all agreed on as African Americans and European Americans was this: African Americans are joining our culture, rooted in English common law and Northwest European social norms. As equal individuals, we will respect as friends. We are friends, absolutely, but we are not changing our culture. They are joining our culture as equals. Europeans, on the other hand, in Europe, have brought in millions of people from dozens of different cultures and faiths, when we Americans needed 100 years to bring one major ethnic group into being part of us. What are Europeans doing? How does this not lead to war? Nonetheless, after deindustrialization through the 1980s, white-collar work became the de facto mode to grow the economy in Europe. And those white-collar workers needed cheap labor to do their dry cleaning, to fetch their coffee. Sad but true. This was certainly beginning by the time of Tony Blair in Britain and Schroeder in Germany during the 1990s, who both opened up to mass migration from the Third World. Now, I can't be too angry at Tony Blair, can I? I mean, I did kind of fall into the whole cool Britannia thing in the 1990s, and I did move to Britain, didn't I? But I do have Scottish ancestry, and that matters. It really does matter if you have ancestry in the culture that you're moving to. Post-1990s, British civic globalism treated nationalism, especially Welsh, English, and Scottish nationalism, as opposed to a meaningless British civic identity, as something to be ashamed of in order to avoid the big questions that always arise out of different nations living in the same state. Like, how do the natives keep their culture? What is the foundation story of our people? What is our people? How do we cope with customs, beliefs, and ideas that cannot coexist with our own ethnogenesis in the post-Roman world, rooted in Plato's ideas of duty, the peace of Westphalia, and Christianity? How many people will come? Instead of answering these questions, anyone asking such things was pushed out of any high-ranking position by shaming them as nationalist, essentially, or even worse, the big scary word used to cast a voodoo spell upon us: racist. Can you imagine how pathetic the Roman army would have been if their leaders told them to feel guilty for their ancestors owning slaves and to knock down the statues of their own generals, whilst flying the flags of sex deification cults and dancing with whores? Since the 1990s in Britain, Germany, France, and elsewhere, that is what is happening. In an age of pure globalization, of deindustrialization, of reducing the nation state in Europe to a corporate logo managed in an economic zone, the nationalism, what was built after the 30 Years' War to unify us against anarchy, against ethno-religious tribalism, and to give us rights within our wider kinfolk groups. That nationalism that was built to protect us is seen as sinful. This will have a backlash. You cannot suppress the thymos, the spiritual and nationalistic nature within man. My British citizenship ceremony should have meant something. It should have been seen as one of life's greatest honors, joining an ancestral nation state of peoples, declaring my allegiance and my loyalty. Oaths. But I was alone, in a room with a CD player, playing the British national anthem, which the woman working there turned off halfway through, as if she was bored. I signed a piece of paper, was given a commemoration coin. That's it. My British citizenship was treated like a bureaucratic process, without any spirit, glory, or honor. And that lack of soul has spread over Western Europe, rotting us from the inside by fusing selfish desires with the Logos, meaning a world governed by reason, in which you can do anything you want, be whoever you want, but there is no depth, there are no ties of blood, your family means nothing, the land that you are from means nothing, there is no honor to anything. And if you seek a spiritual bond with the nation, beyond the bureaucratic processes of the nation state, that might be seen as nationalism. Oh no, which whilst our fathers laid down their lives for it, we are made to feel guilty for the bonds of their blood sacrifice to the land. When I look through history, I am struck by how many nations or peoples come roaring back, breaking up through empires like bamboo shoots through soil, to show themselves again. The Kingdom of Georgia, erased in 1490. Now there is a Georgian nation. Just one example, and it goes on and on. And I know many of you will disagree with me on this next point. But the European Union, for all its good aims at birth, and good deeds, and for all its good intentions, has begun behaving like an empire. forcing refugee quotas and migration on nations whose people do not want it, during, as I said, the largest migration into Europe since the Stone Age. Its leaders treat its native people as enemies when they merely want to express belonging to a people, to a land, and to rekindle the thymos, a bond with faith and spirit. We have a right to be people of somewhere and to not be ruled by people of anywhere. And I cannot help but wonder if yet again Germany will have a revolution that changes all of Europe. It has before. After all, since 1945, most of Europe has tried to ignore its own soul, and so any coming wars of identity could erupt anywhere. But it is Germany who has been made to suffer this tragedy of denying its own soul the most. How will the revolution against anti-nationalism begin? Should be the chwldro yn erbyn gwrthgenedlaetholdeb gychwyn. The coming revolutions of the people against their anti-nationalist governments could truly erupt anywhere. Germany is likely, in my opinion, though it could erupt out of Sweden and the demographic tragedy facing that beautiful nation. Sweden may face a civil war to remain non-Muslim. In France, its traitorous urban upper class may leave patriotic Frenchmen no democratic way to save their country. In Spain, the betrayal of its president Pedro Sanchez, who is giving citizenship to hundreds of thousands of so-called refugees in a single go, has united the nationalist right. The Dutch people of the Netherlands are now an ethnic minority in all of their big cities. In Ireland, hundreds of military-aged foreign men are dropped off in random villages by their own government, and Irish people are arrested for protesting against their ancient villages being ruined by these men, and their women worse. Austria's Vienna, where the Ottoman Empire was stopped by the largest cavalry charge in history, saving Europe from Islam, is now seeing Austrian children become a minority in Vienna's schools. Germany has brought millions in and has suffered a string of horrible attacks on its wonderful Christmas markets, as women are harassed, and there are cases of German children being bullied in schools for not converting to Islam. Next door to me in England, we have seen hate mobs fill streets for nearly 3 years, whilst police arrest native English people for merely questioning if multiculturalism is destroying their country. A revolution against the anti-nationalist insanity we live under could begin in any one of them, spreading to the others like the wildfire revolutions of 1848 in Europe. But I would never underestimate the German people. They have been the spark in almost each great rupture across European history. From Arminius in year 9, stopping the expansion of the Roman Empire, to Aachen becoming the capital of the Holy Roman Empire, ironically, which ensured that a form of Roman and Christian civilization survived the Dark Ages, to Holy Roman Emperor Otto I stopping the Hungarians in 955 and giving all of Western Europe time to breathe and refine itself, to setting a clear line between church and state that slowly over centuries allowed Europeans freedom not found in the Muslim world or the Asiatic world, to the Reformation of Martin Luther, which birthed Protestantism, to the 30 Years' War, and the legal ideas of the nation-state itself, to national romanticism, the fusing together of the German Empire and all that came after it. If I could live in any one city from 1900 to 2000 and see it all the way through with a coherent mind, I would choose Berlin. And no other city even comes close. So much happened. You could say that only Berlin even saw the 20th century. And if that much has come to pass, I wonder if the German people have it in them to begin the revolt against anti-nationalism that is coming, and for that then to spread to other European nations. And yet, the guilt of the post-war generation there is so heavy, and I understand why. I wonder, though, if that ideology of self-hatred will kill the German people as a nation. How long will they accept their Christmas markets being attacked? This is not to say I am for or against the AfD, Alternative for Deutschland. I don't claim to know enough about German politics to have an opinion on that. But it is to say that the German constitution does not allow the German people to vote in any government that is illiberal. And if you deny Europeans, not just Germany but elsewhere, the right to choose a government that is not liberal and open, then a revolt against liberal democracy is inevitable. After all, a nation is not a piece of paper, it is a people. Your institutions and your type of governance is not the nation. But rather than in which nation it will begin in, I can see that it will begin under a set of circumstances. Plato said that the city mirrors the soul, and we have to remember that in his Greece, the city was the people or the state essentially. A just city reflects a just soul, and a Britain whose rulers allow the mass rape of its women to avoid being called racist reflects an English soul, a Welsh soul, and a Scottish soul, all three. Souls which are possessed by an ideology of self-hatred that is so deep, it means that to defend your own people against foreigners is a sin against the church orthodoxy of our age, which is a kind of cultural relativism that denies the thymos, that denies us the faith and passions of our national spirit, that denies us belonging to a tribe, a people. Wherever this has not completely smothered the native people of Europe, wherever passions and love of their own people exist as a group, not individuals, there is hope. And notice I say group there, not individuals. After the Second World War, the conservative right became obsessed with individualism. It let churches fall to ruin in our cities. It let families break apart, and it let mostly homogeneous, happy cultures become tribalized in the name of accelerating GDP and the economy with cheap labor. Plato, the foundation of our Western ideas, understood that good of the whole outweighs the needs of the individual, and that our selfish desires simply do not matter. Plato used the word pleonexia, which is roughly similar in meaning to greed, to explain the root of all political and personal disorder. Pleonexia, he said, is the engine of decay, of social disorder. It is what rots our cities from within and allows barbarians through the gates for the sake of cheap labor to line the pockets of greedy men. For Plato, greed, or pleonexia, was not merely a failure of morality, but an acid which dissolves and erases civilization. The conservatives of my parents' time turned to libertarianism, to Thatcherism, to Reaganism, and yes, it defeated the evils of atheistic communism. But at what cost? We are not merely individuals. We have faiths, families, blood, oaths, and duties to our lands and bonds with our nations. All of that has been cast aside, and for it, like the cities of the Akkadian Empire, or the cities plundered by the Gothic barbarians of Rome, our cities are falling apart. Mobs are gathering in parades calling for the deaths of Jews, and we must organize a resistance to this ethical vacuum of a rotted national soul. So where can we find the thymos, and how do we turn the tide and save our civilization? One answer I give to anyone on social media asking for advice for young men is simple. Go back to church, or if you share my own Jewish faith, go back to synagogue once a week. Be part of something that steps out of the modernity that did this to us. Not only will religion push back against all of these ridiculous post-1960s anti-nationalist ideas, but if we are to enter a period of ethno-religious conflict not seen since the 30 Years' War, you have three main groups to choose from: pro-Western Christians and Jews, anti-Western Marxists, and anti-Western Islam. And this gives you a clue as to where and when this is going to begin. In almost every European country, different groups are moving into areas where there are more of people like them. Not only does this follow ethnicity, but it follows religion too. In fact, religion it follows much more closely than ethnicity, and I do consider progressive Marxism to be a religion. It believes in a utopia brought about by everybody believing it. We saw the same thing happen in the late Roman Empire. Christians, and Jews to be fair, formed dense enclaves within the cities of the empire. The natives moved out of the cities if they did not want to convert. In Welsh, the word pai, meaning country, and French pays, come from pagani, the country folk. The natives of the countryside were not Christian, and so they came to be called pagans. The natives of the Roman Empire lost their culture to immigrants and a foreign religion. And so naturally, why would you fight for the empire if your senators and generals had adopted the culture and faith of foreign barbarians? So they didn't fight for the empire and it fell. We are seeing the earliest stages of something similar with Islam in our cities. But unlike the late Roman Empire, in which under 2% of the non-Christian population outside the cities could read, we have the reverse in modern times. The inner cities of our day are far more illiterate and are often poorer than the countryside. This is a game changer, and it will not go the same way as the native culture of Western Europe being absorbed out like the Gaulish language dying out at the end of the Roman Empire. On top of this, much of Islam is in Arabic, and you must get familiar with the language to have it defeat your culture in the end. Whereas most of the Middle East and all of North Africa spoke Afro-Asiatic languages that, even if distantly, allowed the native population to absorb Arabic faster. Europe has the highest literacy rates in the world, with the greatest and strongest literary traditions in history, whereas almost no one was able to write in Egyptian. Almost everyone in France can read French and write in it, on top of histories of being dominant powers on the world stage, whose identities were founded in a tradition and Judeo and Christian heritage that is completely at odds with the new culture and religion coming in. When you combine all of these things together, it is obvious where the coming wars over European identity will begin. It will begin on the tectonic plates between them, on the edges of our cities. If you are one of those young boys in England, France, Germany, and elsewhere, who has been bullied and beaten up at school for being native to your own land, or if you are a woman in these countries who has been harassed or worse by gangs of men from the Middle East, you are going to move to a place where there are more people like you and less people like them. The countryside of these nations is about to become much more nationalistic, as the cities of these nations become much less English, French, German, Swedish, etc. It is where these two worlds rub up against each other, where the city fades out into the towns, where the population is still a bit dense, that conflicts will naturally begin over territory. We are already seeing this in the form of politics and political parties. In England, nativist parties are winning across the countryside, whilst pro-Gaza parties explicitly on an Islamic platform are winning in the inner cities. In France too, and in Germany, Alternative for Deutschland is beginning to do the same thing there. So far in Germany, the electoral system, which was designed to favor coalitions, is being used strongly between Marxist and migrant groups, and has stopped the native backlash from taking power. And I wonder if this will force the nativist German political party to moderate and align with the center-right conservatives. I don't know how that will go. I need to learn more about Germany, and I'm actually doing so at the moment. Let me know if you want more on that topic. In France, the presidential runoff system has stopped its own native backlash from gaining the highest levels of government, though that wall is breaking down. In Britain, there is no such system, and so the center-left has held power only because the old post-war right and its strange obsession with libertarian, low-tax, hyper-individualist ideas has not fully gone away yet. In fact, this is a tendency in Germany and France too. But as the baby boomer post-war kids slowly leave us, that 1980s pro-market libertarianism is leaving us too. Plato would have hated the 1980s pro-market right. It had no sense of duty to the nation. It was all about the individual. It was all about what I and me wanted, nothing of us. And about that us, Plato saw religion as a civic necessity, not because he believed in it, but because he understood belonging, and besides, he was a bit elitist. He was a bit of a snob. He saw philosophy as too demanding for most, and religion, he rightly saw, in my opinion, as fusing some truths with the social unity we all need, not just to create a healthy nation, but strong families and happy children. As the post-war order breaks down, as the childish ideas of John Lennon's Kumbaya utopia without nations is slowly seen for what it is, hatred of the West and hatred of our ancestors, even some left-wing politicians are having to accept that not all groups can live together in large numbers. When I began this video, I said it is not all doom and gloom. It isn't. The Dutch Republic made some bad mistakes. For instance, in 1672, when England, Germany, and several German states attacked the Dutch Republic, you might expect the Netherlands not to come back from that, and its own arrogance really caused the war. And Johan de Witt, a grand pensionary, which is a high civil servant, along with his brother Cornelis, were blamed and hanged by an angry mob in the street, who proceeded to eat their corpses. But the point is, the Dutch Republic survived a war on 3 fronts, and angry mobs briefly taking power, by flooding their own country with water and raising William of Orange to power, who brought alliances that pushed the French back. If the Netherlands, a small country, can survive a war against England, France, and most of Western Germany at once, by flooding their own country and raising up a prince over a republic, we can survive this crazy post-war age of mass migration and endless tolerance we find ourselves in. More realistically, Plato is the foundation of Western philosophy, and he was not a Democrat. Being Welsh, being French, American, Swedish, English has nothing to do with the institutions of our nations. A nation is a people, not a form of government. Democracy is preferable, but it's not what makes you American. Whatever oaths our military officers take, I believe in my heart that the armies of every Western nation are still more loyal to their own people than they are to the institutions of their states. There are only so many mobs taking over our cities that they will put up with. There are only so many times barbarians can rape our women in the name of a foreign religion that our military generals will accept. Peoples in every one of these countries are moving out of the inner cities to be with their own nation. That is not racist or whatever you want to call it. It's called being human. We love our people. This will not end like the Roman Empire because we can read. Yes, we can read. Having 99% of us be literate is so powerful. We have an inheritance in our Greco-Roman civilization, alongside our Germanic and Roman legal systems, rooted in criminal justice and the honest forgiveness built out of both Christianity and Judaism, that creates a world worth fighting for. When confronted with the evils of jihad and Marxism, the coming decades will not be easy. Anyone who thinks so is a fool, in my opinion. But we get to live in turbulent times. We can still avoid the coming wars, but it would take a political revolution across the West. To stop the coming wars, we would have to redefine citizenship. I kind of like the Starship Troopers idea that you had to have served in the army to be a citizen, but that's a bit harsh. I mean, it genuinely works in Israel. Why do you think they are so amazing? We would have to bring migration down to a net negative in multiple Western nations. And that is without even touching on the cancer of postmodernism we have to extract from our universities in order to save the future. Somehow, and I do not claim to have the wisdom to know how to do this, we must forge a healthy nationalism without any Marxist 1960s stuff, not based in any hyper-individualism. All that 1960s stuff and cultural relativism has to go if we want to have a future. If we fail to stop it, I don't know which country it will begin in first, but wherever the spark finally catches fire, the inner cities will not be safe. My guess is that around the borders of the large cities is where it will start with turf wars between natives and migrant tribes. Cities will fall under siege in some places, supply routes will be cut, some cities will see Islamic enclaves held under warlords, and all the horrors of that. But I have faith we will win. Not only that, it will not even be close. We will take back our cities. It will be brutal, and the countryside will become united as a people. We will see how foolish the West has been. When we do win, and we must keep saying we will win, our children's children will enjoy a social unity of strong families, faith, and a sense of civic duty to people and nation, with a sense of order that was denied us by the decadence and selfish anything-goes attitude of the post-war era. Thank you very much for watching. Please donate to the channel with Buy Me a Coffee or a super like, and let me know what you thought about the video below. Until the next time.